I mean,
Well, what is the provisional summary, though? I mean, how would people,
an amazing range of new, cool ways of approaching the assessment space, which, I mean, from that perspective, it was a great day, right? I thought things were a little bit light on what it was that you're assessing,
right,
that which could be articulated. So it reminded me of Feynman's Carter Felt, right? The tribe sits there and makes the runway over and over again and gets really, really good at making the runway, and it doesn't happen because, of course, the planes aren't hitting. I wonder about these things when it comes to our propensity to like the new gadgets and widgets and things.
well, see,
because
there's a version of that question which I wanted to raise too, and that is, basically you think about, so far people have been calibrating against the big five. One of the big questions is the big five sufficiently adequate? What are the other dimensions? And there we really want to go to some action, something we really care about. See, what are the good predictors, right? And there hasn't been that much of that so far. I mean, the March paper was interesting, but you really anchored yourself strongly on the big five, right? Yes.
Yeah, I'm totally not wet to the big five.
No, but that means the analysis you gave today.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying you personally. I mean,
No, I think that's why it's so interesting that we have that data, because like that's what's going back to what you were saying. We don't even at some point don't necessarily need to think in scales. So you can just see like what are the behaviors that are predictive and how do they map onto some of the constructs that we already know, but also what do they explain about them beyond.
some of Armin's work, I hope you're going to talk a little bit about it, well, is relevant. You see there are dimensions of economic performance, which we haven't really mentioned, risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, reciprocity, things that are not usually on the table for psychologists, but we do think they're predictive for behavior, at least in laboratory settings, and they're different from. But we know that both of those scales seem to be predictive, even even in laboratory gains, right? Risk aversion moderated by, say, intelligence or conscientiousness or something. So it's a question of how many dimensions, and then Michelle was talking about 137 dimensions, I thought, at one time.
And just two quick clarifications. Psychologists do work on reciprocity and risk
Right.
patients, of course.
Yeah.
But when it comes to explaining, say, behaviors or outcomes in representative samples,
It's an earthquake.
economic preferences really add much to Big Five. They actually complementing each other. It's no substitutes.
Right. So then what's the right dimension for performance?
I mean,
Well, it's a question
I
as to is
also
the big
kind of-
five particularly good?
I'd like to also kind of reinforce what Brent was saying, and this is now broadening up to some extent. It's really the question what we are interested in and after. I mean, Jim is pushing the agenda of predicting, right? And of course that is super important. The other is what I would like to call understanding, which is not exactly the same. I mean, we could come up with some weird notion which happens to kind of, say, predict or correlate. I mean, causality is another elephant in this room, I guess. It correlates well with, some particular outcome. But we don't understand why, and we don't have a feeling or understanding what this construct is actually all about. And I think one of the big advantages from rooting our, explanatory variables in concepts or theories. This doesn't need to be economic theories, of course, don't get me wrong, but to have some, conceptual background, a framework, makes it much easier to understand why we see that correlation and to interpret and also make it portable to other contexts. Right? Otherwise, the risk is that, what's the best predictor for a particular outcome? So take we had this one example on some performance, I think it was your presentation, on some performance tasks, right? I mean, the best predictor of that, say, performance is exactly that task. If I want to predict, do you want to have a Diet Coke or regular Coke? I just, give you the choice, right? And I can perfectly predict that, right? But the reach from that choice to any other context or any other decision we're interested in is virtually zero, right? So I may be very good in predicting very specific things, but then lose on, generalizability, portability,
Sure.
and scope and understanding. And I think that is the big advantage of restricting our explanatory variables to constructs that are rooted in some psychological or economic or other framework.
But if your goal is to
And
somehow
for
get
risk
kids to
take-
read by
take-
third
take
grade,
preferences.
you have very specific
No,
goals.
no, let me
You
try
go back to prediction. I
No,
think.
let me try to just one quick comment. I mean, when we talk about preferences, for example,
Yeah.
I mean, all the economists in the room know that there's an infinite amount of preferences. We can have a preference for glasses, for shirts, for suits, for whatnot.
Factor analyzed into the big five.
But we're not interested, I'm not interested in whether you like ice cream or chocolate. I'm just not interested unless I want to sell it or I'm, a marketing guy in a particular domain, right? But risk preferences, patience, loss aversion, ambiguity aversion, big five, these things, locus of control, etc., explain a huge range of outcomes. And this is why they, I don't have a good wording for it, but these are, say, general traits, right? And they happen to be rooted in some construct or some conceptual framework. I think that is maybe, I hope this is what you had in mind in your comment on be a little weak or
Well, I mean,
light-weighted.
I'm an old school personality psychologist, so you guys all described what we used to do back in the 1950s to create measures like the MMPI, where you get a group of depressed people and throw 450 items at them, and a group of schizophrenics and throw the same 450 items at them. You come up with a beautiful empirical predictive equation based on the response to those items. So this, we have the same. It's just wonderful hearing some of the quotes. I think one of the quotes that Jim had this morning was exactly Meal's quote about the way responding to personality questions items is a behavior in itself. And it doesn't. The interpretation of that should be dictated by the validity, not by the question itself. And so I think everything we heard today is perfect for remanifesting that type of thing. Do you do it in the absence of knowing that a lot of the world can be organized with the big five? A lot of the world can be organized according to IQ tests and different types of abilities. Vocational interests could subsume most of the preferences you guys talk about. I think it would be wise to condition most of the discussion on those domains, because then you could actually know what's going on. We had a little bit of that, first off, in terms of thoughts and or cognitions, I should say, beliefs and the like. So, but that was a very specific thing, right? And so we didn't talk about content. And what I worry about with the allusion to the cargo cult is that, you can do all these things and just miss the target completely. Because the thing, I told somebody this anecdote. We had a 40-year longitudinal study of Luxembourgians, and we had 150 student-based questions that they filled out self-report style when they were 11. Beautiful, just everything you could possibly want to know about a student and their experience in school. And we had one item rated by the teachers. This is a hard-working student. What predicted educational attainment, income, occupational attainment, morbidity, and mortality? All of those. The one item from the teacher. No, it's probably not just whether they're hardworking, but that's what I kind of fear is we can, if you go too hard on the theory side, you have to do these things, you miss the target. If you go too hard on the empirical side, without the target, you might be doing great work, but you're doing something that's not going to have any utility. So I think a little bit of this could be conditioned back and forth. So I don't have any problem with doing the big five for a little bit, but we shouldn't limit ourselves to that by any means. Just an opinion.
Just adding on to that, it just occurs to me, and I'm not a personality psychologist by training, but I think that one of the things that I take from what you're saying, right, is that what makes some of these things valuable, and perhaps more valuable than others, is their sort of utility to predict across contexts. Because the idea is that we're capturing some latent thing that would determine behavior across, in the ideal sense, right, a true personality trait would be true across all contexts. If you could perfectly explain it, you could perfectly explain behavior if you had some knowledge of the settings. That's sort of maybe coming from the computational side over the idealistic. But I guess what excites me about a lot of the work that was presented today is the ability that we're starting to get that was more difficult back in the 1950s to actually capture data from the same person across a bunch of different contexts, both social contexts where they're engaging in different kinds of activities. And I feel like that allows us to do something in terms of trying to organically come up with dimensions that wouldn't have been possible before, because you now could actually get not only longitudinal data, but really densely sampled data about the same person interacting with many different people, some of them virtual, some of them real, interacting in various different settings. And so now if you can take all of that data, I feel like we are probably closer to being able to figure out what things are predicted across contexts, and that might be a way of starting to work towards a definition of something that could occupy the same kind of space that things like Big Five or some of these other traits do.
I agree. It would be nice to have that, but I didn't see that today.
Maybe I see the potential for it.
But don't be surprised if we come up with a Big Five again. I mean,
No, I think
trust
we
me,
might
we
be
tried.
doing
Because you do whatever sampling frame you want in terms of the content, and when we've done that, we kind of come up with a Big Five. Some cultures have honesty, except for the U.S., which I find somewhat ironic. Right, so you do get some other dimensions in some cases. You also get very specific if you want to, without much difficulty. But they're there for a reason. They cover most of the interpersonal types of behaviors that we exhibit, and then they relate to work. They relate to fear and danger. These are all fundamental things for survival and reproduction. There's a reason why they're there. You can get different flavors and the like, but I think if we do a ground up again, we're gonna get something close to it.
I'm less confident than you in the sense that I think, at one point Angela and I thought we could take all the Big Five and map it into all of the economic preference parameters, and we couldn't. I mean, I had this table, and I worked on it for 6 months, and I finally threw it away because I do think things like risk aversion, ambiguity aversion, some of these reciprocity, they weren't so easily captured.
Patience. I mean, we've just
Time preference.
run several papers.
And those things matter for real behavior. I mean, savings behavior,
This is too particular to you guys, but economists, I think some of us who aren't economists usually notice this, you're really smart. And there's a bad habit in most people who create measures to project themselves into their measures. So the psychologists will put a lot of neuroticism in their measures. And you got your measures are confounded with your intelligence. So patience measured by behavior is going to be different.
Can I comment on this?
But I mean, we're talking about savings behavior.
Well, that's different than patience.
Are you gonna save for a rainy day or something?
This is going the wrong way. This is going totally wrong.
Okay.
Now, every decision involves risk. Why? Because the world is uncertain, by definition.
Yeah,
Second, every decision is in some relation to the future, which is why patience matters. And what we call patience is very simple, right? Am I willing to forego some consumption, say today, to have somewhat more in the future, right? It's a very simple trade-off we are facing everywhere, every day, all the time. You can elicit it in very simple ways, using, say, quantitative measures, but also qualitative items. And if you do, you get explanatory power when it comes to explaining differences in GDP between 76 countries. That is just amazing. And Big Five wouldn't do anything of that. Likewise, trust, for example, which has been used previously, there's no explanatory power whatsoever once you conditional patience. Patience explains difference in income between countries, between regions within country, and also at the individual level. And why does it? Because it explains capital accumulation, both human capital and physical capital, and for the economist, total factor productivity, institutions, etc. This is a well-defined concept and notion, and it's orthogonal to what we measure in Big Five. It is super predictive, super important, and easy to measure.
Actually, you saw the patience. This one I saw another paper on. I think you're talking about the delayed gratification.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Delayed gratification actually has lots to do with conscientiousness. Because I think
we have run the correlations of representative samples. The correlations are weak.
I agree. So I think one of the things that we also found that it's called, I think the Big Five is very basic, very generic, right? I think you helped me do a slide one talking about this. Also context sensitivity. So for example, we talk about openness just in general. It's ridiculously not accurate, right? So I'm very open to science, to technology. I'm extremely conservative on food. I would never ever taste the food I've never seen before. So in that case, it is I think one of the things at least in psychology, probably it's difficult to collect data to that one is if we put the context at another dimension, we combine with those big five, you will see many things are can be better explained. So it's very, you may use a different term to do that, right? So for example,
Yeah, but patience is not a different context to big five.
So let me just put,
I think it is. You're talking about the time, talk about temporal.
No.
Right?
I'm neither saying context would be relevant. I mean, of course, context matters, and everybody agrees, right? That's true also if you list economic preferences, for example. I mean, if you ask, say, for your willingness to take risks in a particular domain, guess what? You explain that domain better than in comparison to, say, asking more generally about, say, your willingness to take risks. So I don't see what.
I think when I say context, not necessarily domain context, also space and time. Your patience basically talking about time context, temporal context.
It's talking about a
right?
well-defined
By
trade-off.
definition, right? So
It's talking about a well-defined trade-off, which has no equivalent in the big five.
But then even if we like,
But
all
I think
agree that
it's a
it would be
continuum.
nice to go beyond the big five, which I think we all do.
Yeah.
But I think it's even more important that we come up with the measures. Because why is it that we can't administer all the tests? Because we don't have infinite time.
right.
So if we're kind of working with participants in the lab, we just can't keep them for, well, you can probably do that, I usually don't.
You can keep it
Keep it
forever,
for 3
such
hours,
but you
but
get
if we
crappy
can actually
answers.
automate it to some extent, and we
can
can
keep it
predict
for-
those things by just kind of looking at what people write in their Facebook status updates on Twitter, then we can actually look at a lot more theoretical constructs within, like, with actually applying fewer resources. So
Do you think you can do that going forward, though? In other words, using the kind of Facebook data you're talking about and predict decisions like, graduating college, committing crime, actual real behaviors. I mean, I'm just wondering empirically, is it possible to link that kind of social media data to actual behaviors?
yeah, so one thing is that and it doesn't even have to be only social media, so you can definitely get from behavior to future behavior, like whether they graduate college, whether they default on a loan. But I think one of the advantages of having the theoretical construct is that it helps you avoid, in one way, like the bias that everybody talks about in the machine learning world. It's like, how do we, like, if we just look at someone's past behaviors, predict whether they're going to default or commit a crime, what we get is we're just kind of perpetuating what's been historically shown to work. Like, if we look at who's going to be selected into the board of Fortune 500 company, it's probably like the algorithm would probably ask like men, mainly. And if we kind of work with theoretical constructs, we can actually uncover what's happening behind the scenes, and we get a better understanding of what is it that the algorithm is actually doing, what are the criteria that it's choosing based on. So that's kind of the advantage that we get if we look at it from a more theoretical construct side, and not just let the algorithm figure out what's happening.
Right. But I thought you were advocating machine learning.
Machine learning, like within this additional level of understanding. So I think that's why it's important that social scientists are involved in the discussion. So it's not just that feed the machine whatever it
Well, I
wants to
agree.
have.
I don't
and
think
get
a
it out.
machine by itself
Yeah.
is going to do the job.
I mean, it might do a good job of predicting it, but like in the context of the historical development of how things were traditionally set up.
But that's how in certain areas, just taking your example about women, some recent papers, I think you know this paper in Denmark, looking at the productivity of men and women where you actually had true measures, individual characteristics and productivity, and finding out how much of the gap in wages was really could be attributed to bias and how much was actually true productivity, and explaining most of the gap by productivity characteristics, for example, except for mothers with children, single mothers with children. But the point is, so the idea is you resolve these things into characteristics which themselves are valued in the labor market, and they're priced out in the labor market, and that gives you some way to sort of compare a man and a woman. How many of these characteristics do they have?
But that also means that you're kind of looking at it in the context that we currently have, right? Like right now, it might be the case that there's like a difference in productivity, like between men and women. If the context was different, maybe not. Which is why actually what you need in the algorithms is noise. Like if you just train it on biased data, what you get is like the same exact historical context that we
Well, no,
have.
but I mean, if you could sort of measure what the productivity, I'm talking about productivity characteristics like education, you know, things that have to do with number of publications, the number of referrals if you're, you know, a lawyer or a doctor. So these are traits, these are things that are actually quite well embodied in terms of what we know to be productive. So for example, for certain kinds of occupations, dexterity is important. So, you know, there are certain manual and physical and mental traits that have been shown to be very important for some tasks and not for others.
I think the challenge to what is, and I think what you're saying is that in the case of publications, it may be that there's a bias against choosing to publish articles submitted by women faculty. And if that was the case, then you would still get productivity measures that came out to show a gap, but that gap could in fact be due to the sort of gendered stereotypes and bias that's being sort
But
of.
let me give you the
perpetuated.
best example. That could be certainly true. But what about the ability to pick fruit from a peach tree? So you're basically, you're just doing piece rate labor that's directly related to your ability to lift things out of the tree, or maybe even better, picking fruit off of the ground, or harvesting some crop. You know, that would involve strength, that would involve some kind of dexterity and so forth.
The best predictor would be not being on Facebook.
Probably.
Be a 0
Well,
one.
you might be
I'll
able
put
to
money on
wear
that.
Facebook like a, like an harmonica or something around your neck and watch it.
Can I make a comment? I think these two approaches are really it's a balance. It's a judgment call. I see two major approaches in machine learning thing. One is some algorithm would just predict digital outcomes directly without going through any psychological traits. Well, companies like Judy would like to predict personality traits and hoping or assuming machine input personality traits were predicting for the outcomes. So I see these two approaches, both are pro and cons. The direct approach is definitely they will win on the predictive competition, because they don't care which they're measuring. All they care is can I maximize validity. But the problem with this approach is you have to tailor make every organization, different organization you attend to, every job position you attend to. You have to rebuild your predictive model to make it meaningful. But the other side, like if you just don't predict personality traits, the good thing about that is you predict something that's universal. You can carry it around, because all jobs would love to have high conscientious people working on it, right? But the problem is when you kind of assume the link between machine input personality scores or other psychological scores with important outcomes, that link, how strong is that link? Probably not very strong. So this approach also might miss some important information. That's
You know, it
compared to
does.
direct approach.
No, when you look at earnings data for directly, say just earnings, and you have measures of IQ, and you have measures of all the big five, and even some other traits, you're explaining maybe what, 10%, 12% of earnings? I mean, there's a huge variability still there. That's earnings, just a very aggregate thing. So it's transportable, but it's kind of loaded differently in different occupations. If you start defining it more narrowly, I bet you the predictive power goes up. But then you would fit different models, because there's comparative advantage in different occupations. Some occupations are intensive in one trait and not in another. So,
And I wonder about that diversity, whether, try to just go for some general characteristics that we think are applicable to everything.
right.
That eliminates the diversity that is there in the population and in the workforce.
And in the
need in the
workforce,
workforce.
yeah. I mean, we know there are a variety of separate tasks.
I mean, I used to be a software engineer. Let me say that I've heard a number of people say the best software engineers are lazy. That's an important quality.
Lazy?
Because when you're lazy, you say, I want to make a machine do it.
Yeah, true. So you're right.
You want to make the code
Absolutely right.
But who is
Yeah.
going to put on their interview
smart.
questionnaire, I want to find someone who's lazy.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like we talked about this morning too. There's a lot of stuff that when you try to have the same definition of traits in the same way and apply them similarly to all different contexts, all that diversity is noise. Whereas if you can, to the extent that you can isolate down or move down, and you probably are better doing that if you have some structures or theories that help you get down further, you can make that variation into something that you can use rather than lose.
And that's the potential of the approaches we saw today, because listening to your talk, I was haunted by a conversation I had with an industrial psychologist who you know. In industrial psychology, the gold standard is the assessment center, which is what you described perfectly, right? The rich data set where you bring a CEO in and put them through the ringer for the entire day. You have 10 people watching them, they do all these different tasks. End of the day, you get 10 ratings, you use that. It has the best validity of any technique possible. And my friend said, I can get 80% of that validity with a 15-minute personality inventory. And I mean, and he's right. I mean, we can malign inventories, we can say these are proxies, this is a bad thing, but the return on investment for getting the rich data in the traditional approaches just doesn't make sense. All the techniques you saw today give us the opportunity to do what you do in an assessment center passively, easily, even with people being intrinsically motivated to fill out the questions. Right? So what you've got is beautiful from that perspective. You can get to that richness without the burden that we usually have. So.
Yeah, I think that's where the payoff for the technology is.
So one of the issues we didn't discuss so much today was about the metric of measurement, and I think this is related to what Jim just said, that when we have a lot of information, IQ, Big Five and others, and try to explain wages, for example, the explanatory power gets much better when you focus within an occupation, for example, because I think this is what the people always think about their peer groups. So when I ask someone, are you lazy, then people think about how lazy I am related to the people I know, because it's really hard to make a judgment outside the group, and so every scientist sometimes has the feeling, am I more lazy than my colleague next door, and so on. But altogether, related to the whole population, maybe no one is lazy here. And I think one of these problems might be solved if there would be a true metric that allows to order people even outside of a group or comparing different groups of people. And I would be interested if in one of these approaches that we have here today, people have thought about the problem of metrics and comparability.
You know what you get, I'm not sure if that's getting to your question, but one of the issues in this case is the reference group effect, and that's actually what's not entirely eliminated, but more eliminated when you can use self-reports when you have these objective behavioral measures. So just one example of a paper that got published by Yo-Yo actually. So one of the concepts in psychology, the lofty thing that Michelle is also talking about, that people kind of should be more similar to their friends, to their spouses, which is an effect that you don't find if you use self-report measures, because if you say how similar are you to your spouse, you always kind of contrast yourself, and so you might think you're more extroverted or not. If you actually use behavioral measures, you find these effects, and they're pretty strong. So that's actually an indication that if you use those behavioral measures, you get rid of some of these reference group effects, which means that you can compare it across occupations, across cultures for the first time, really. That's the initial evidence.
Do you think online behavior is itself a specific context that might motivate people, as you said, Facebook isn't always how their real life is, so is there?
I think one of the things that, the way that I think about is it should be more of a parallel shift than a crossover. So it's very unlikely that, let's say, I'm super extroverted, you're introverted, and suddenly on the online world we just cross over. It would probably be a parallel
degree.
shift. So, but again, at some point, I think the more data we have and the more data sources we can combine, you can look at people's networks, right, and see in comparison to their network how much do they stand out. How might their network influence the way that they see themselves, the way that they present themselves? Or if we can combine it with, physiological measures like video data, you can actually kind of try and see, like, it's then becoming more of an idea of like authenticity or like convergence,
Yeah.
which could in and by itself be a predictor of whatever success. But yeah,